My name is Rachel Martinez and I'm 28 years old. I never thought I'd be standing in the elegant ballroom of the Nines Hotel, watching my husband's coworkers' faces drain of color as they realized the woman they'd been calling a gold digger actually owned more gold than all of them combined. The moment Victoria Adams discovered that the quiet nonprofit worker she'd been mocking for 2 years was worth over $12 million was almost worth every snide comment I'd endured. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I learned early that money changes people in ways they don't always recognize. My grandmother, Maria Santos, had built something extraordinary from nothing. Starting with a single small grocery store in the Hawthorne District in the 1970s, she grew her business into Santos Organic Markets, a chain of 15 premium organic grocery stores across the Pacific Northwest. What made her stores special wasn't just the organic produce or the carefully curated selection of artisanal goods, but the way she treated her employees like family and her customers like honored guests. When my grandmother passed away when I was 24, I inherited everything. The stores, the real estate they occupied, the distribution relationships, the loyal customer base, and most importantly, the philosophy that guided it all. The lawyers explained that the business was worth approximately $12.3 million, generating steady annual profits that would allow me to live comfortably for the rest of my life without ever working another day. But here's what they couldn't quantify: the weight of responsibility I felt to honor my grandmother's legacy. Maria Santos had been the most authentic person I'd ever known. She never flaunted her success, never treated people differently based on their bank accounts, and never lost sight of the values that built her empire. She drove the same Honda Civic for 15 years, shopped at her own stores not because she owned them but because she genuinely believed in the products, and gave away more money than most people ever see. When she died, I found ledgers documenting decades of anonymous donations to families in need, scholarships for immigrant children, and support for local farmers transitioning to organic practices. The inheritance came with a choice: I could sell everything and walk away wealthy, or I could step into her shoes and try to continue what she'd started. The business practically ran itself with the incredible management team she'd assembled, but it needed someone from the family to maintain the vision and values. I chose to honor her memory, but I also made another choice that would shape everything that followed. I decided to live as quietly as she had, to keep my wealth private, and to see if I could build genuine relationships with people who knew me for who I was, not what I owned. That decision led me to David Chen, though he has no idea how our love story really began. I was browsing the philosophy section at Powell's Books on a rainy Thursday afternoon, taking a break from reviewing quarterly reports from the store managers, when I noticed someone at a nearby table completely absorbed in a thick programming manual. He had coffee-stained notes scattered around him, was muttering code under his breath, and looked like he'd been there for hours. When he finally looked up and caught me watching him, he smiled with such genuine embarrassment that I couldn't help but laugh. We started talking about books, then life, then everything. David told me about his work as a software developer at TechFlow Solutions, his dreams of eventually starting his own company, and his frustration with the competitive culture at his office. I told him I worked in community outreach, which wasn't entirely a lie since I did volunteer at the Riverside Community Center teaching financial literacy classes to low-income families. What I didn't mention was that my volunteer work was funded by anonymous donations from Santos Organic Markets, or that I could afford to volunteer because I didn't need the income. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally. David was impressed by my knowledge of business and my insights into retail operations, which I explained away as having grown up around small businesses. When he wondered how I could afford my modest but comfortable apartment in Hawthorne on a nonprofit salary, I mentioned a small inheritance from my grandmother, which was true even if it was dramatically understated. When we moved in together after 18 months of dating, I continued paying most of our expenses through a careful system of found deals, lucky breaks, and occasional gifts from my fictitious extended family. David fell in love with Rachel, the community activist, the woman who spent her Saturdays teaching teenagers about budgeting and her evenings reading philosophy books. He had no idea he was dating Rachel, the business owner, the woman who received weekly reports from 15 store locations and quarterly meetings with accountants about profit margins and expansion opportunities. The deception wasn't malicious, but it grew more complex as our relationship deepened. When David proposed after 3 years together, I said yes immediately. I loved this kind, brilliant, genuine man who cared more about solving interesting problems than accumulating wealth, who treated everyone with respect regardless of their job title, and who made me laugh every single day. But I also knew that marriage would make maintaining my secret more complicated. Joint bank accounts, tax filings, and shared financial decisions would eventually reveal the truth, so I planned to tell him everything during our engagement. But then I met his coworkers and everything changed. TechFlow Solutions occupied 2 floors of a gleaming building in Portland's South Waterfront District, filled with the kind of young professionals who measured success in salary figures and stock options. The company culture was aggressively competitive, with open discussions about compensation packages, real estate investments, and luxury purchases. During my first visit to David's office for a casual lunch, I immediately felt the subtle but unmistakable evaluation happening around me. Victoria Adams made the strongest first impression, and not in a good way. As a senior project manager, she commanded respect through a combination of genuine competence and calculated intimidation. She was undeniably successful, earning close to $150,000 annually, driving a BMW, and living in an expensive Pearl District loft. She was also beautiful in that polished professional way that suggested significant investment in appearance and image. When David introduced me to the team, Victoria's eyes swept over my thrift store cardigan, my simple wedding ring from a vintage shop, and my well-worn canvas bag with undisguised assessment. Her smile was perfectly professional and completely cold as she shook my hand and said how lovely it was to meet David's fiancée. The way she emphasized fiancé made it sound like a temporary condition.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She expected to remedy. Amanda Foster and Kevin Thompson, 2 developers on David's team, were friendlier but no less evaluative. They asked about my work with bright, interested expressions that barely concealed their surprise that someone with David's potential had chosen someone so obviously beneath his socioeconomic level. Lisa Park, Victoria's closest friend at the company, simply looked confused, as if she couldn't understand what David saw in someone so ordinary. The comments started immediately, though never when David was present. During the engagement party his coworkers threw at a trendy downtown restaurant, I overheard Victoria explaining to someone from another department that David was going through a phase with someone very different from his usual type. When I joined a conversation about weekend plans, Amanda mentioned how expensive her new yoga studio membership was, then looked at me with fake concern and asked if the community center where I worked offered fitness classes, since I probably couldn't afford private options. The assumptions they made were both insulting and oddly amusing. They assumed I was financially dependent on David, that I was impressed by their lifestyle choices, and that I was probably angling for a more lucrative husband. They treated me with the particular condescension reserved for people they considered gold diggers, social climbers who had temporarily fooled someone valuable but would eventually be found out. Kevin once asked me directly if I planned to keep working after the wedding, with the kind of knowing look that suggested he assumed I was planning to quit my job and live off David's income. When I said I loved my work and intended to continue, Lisa laughed and said how refreshing it was to meet someone so committed to public service, even if it meant financial sacrifice. The implication was clear: they thought I was performing dedication to community work while secretly planning to abandon it the moment I secured David's financial support. The wedding planning period intensified their scrutiny. Victoria made pointed comments about venue choices, suggesting that David deserved something more elegant than the intimate ceremony we were planning at Laurelhurst Park. When David mentioned that I had insisted on paying for my own wedding dress, Victoria raised her eyebrows and said how independent I was, though her tone suggested she found my independence suspicious rather than admirable. Amanda and Lisa took particular interest in our housing situation. When they learned we were staying in my apartment rather than upgrading to something larger, they exchanged meaningful glances and made comments about how David was probably being practical about taking on additional financial responsibilities. The suggestion that I was a financial burden he needed to carefully manage was so ridiculous it was almost funny, but it also stung because David seemed oblivious to these undercurrents. The most difficult part wasn't the comments themselves, but watching how they affected David without his realizing it. He began second-guessing decisions we'd made together, wondering if we should have chosen a more expensive restaurant for our rehearsal dinner or if my dress was formal enough for the occasion. He started apologizing for things that didn't require apologies, like my choice to walk to work instead of driving, or my preference for farmers market produce over grocery store convenience. During one particularly uncomfortable dinner with his colleagues, Victoria steered the conversation toward real estate investments and retirement planning. She talked extensively about her portfolio diversification and her plans to purchase a vacation home in Bend. When she asked about our financial goals, David looked uncomfortable and gave vague answers about paying off student loans and building savings. I could see him measuring our modest lifestyle against his coworkers' apparent wealth and finding it lacking. That night, he asked me if I ever felt inferior around his colleagues. The question broke my heart because it revealed how their attitudes were poisoning his perception of our relationship. I assured him that I didn't, which was true, but I couldn't explain that my lack of insecurity came from knowing I could buy Victoria's BMW with pocket change if I wanted to. Instead, I had to watch the man I loved begin doubting the value of what we'd built together because other people had convinced him it wasn't impressive enough. The situation reached a breaking point during TechFlow's annual holiday party, an elaborate affair held at the Nines Hotel in downtown Portland. The company had rented the entire ballroom, hired a jazz band, and provided an open bar featuring top-shelf liquor. The guest list included not just employees but also clients, investors, and other important business connections. David had been looking forward to the event for weeks, seeing it as an opportunity to network and potentially advance his career. I chose my outfit carefully, selecting a simple black dress I'd found at a vintage boutique. It was actually a designer piece from the 1990s, beautifully cut and made from expensive fabric, but it looked understated rather than flashy. I paired it with my grandmother's pearl earrings, the only obviously valuable jewelry I owned, and carried a small clutch I'd bought at a craft fair. To Victoria and her circle, I probably looked like someone who had tried her best with limited resources. The party was in full swing when we arrived, with groups of well-dressed professionals clustered around high tables, networking with the intensity that characterized every TechFlow social event. David immediately began working the room, introducing me to clients and senior management with obvious pride. I could see him hoping that his colleagues would recognize what he saw in me, that they would understand why he'd chosen someone who didn't fit their typical image of success. But Victoria had other plans. She had positioned herself near the bar with Amanda, Lisa, and several other coworkers, holding court in a way that made it clear she was the social center of the evening. Her dress was stunning and obviously expensive, her jewelry was clearly high-end, and her confidence was absolute. When she spotted David and me across the room, she waved us over with a smile that made my stomach clench with apprehension. The conversation started innocuously enough, with compliments on the venue and discussion of the evening's entertainment. But Victoria quickly steered things toward more personal territory, asking about my work at the community center and expressing amazement at my dedication to helping others despite the financial limitations of nonprofit work. She talked about her own charitable contributions, mentioning specific dollar amounts that were clearly intended to highlight the difference between her disposable income and my supposed lack thereof. When David stepped away to get drinks, Victoria's mask slipped entirely. She leaned in close and said how much she admired my commitment to community service, but wondered if I'd considered how my career choices might limit David's options. She suggested that ambitious men needed partners who could contribute equally to building wealth and status, not ones who required support and subsidies. Her words were carefully chosen to sound like friendly advice, but the message was unmistakable. I was holding David back and she was available as an alternative. The other women joined in with similar observations disguised as concern. Amanda mentioned how expensive it was becoming to maintain a professional lifestyle in Portland and how important it was for couples to be financially compatible. Lisa talked about her friends who had married for love rather than practical considerations and how those relationships had struggled under financial pressure. They painted a picture of me as a romantic idealist who hadn't considered the practical implications of my choices, while positioning themselves as sophisticated realists who understood what successful men really needed. I listened to their analysis of my relationship with growing amazement. They had constructed an entire narrative about my motivations, my capabilities, and my worth based on assumptions that were completely wrong. They saw my volunteer work as evidence of limited ambition rather than genuine commitment. They interpreted my modest lifestyle as financial constraint rather than conscious choice. They assumed David was supporting me rather than the other way around. But the final straw came when Victoria made a comment that crossed every line of decency and respect. She said she hoped David would eventually understand that love wasn't enough to build a secure future, and that sometimes the kindest thing a person could do was step aside to let someone they cared about find a more suitable partner. She delivered this suggestion with such condescending sympathy that I felt my grandmother's fierce pride rising in my chest like a tide. That's when I decided it was time to set the record straight. I excused myself and walked to a quiet corner of the ballroom, pulling out my phone with steady hands despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Robert Hayes, my financial advisor, and placed a call that I knew would change everything. Robert answered immediately, probably wondering why I was calling him at 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening. My voice was calm and clear as I spoke, though I made sure it was loud enough for Victoria and her circle to overhear. I told Robert that I'd been thinking about our discussion regarding the expansion of Santos Organic Markets into the Seattle market, and that I was ready to move forward with the acquisition of those 3 potential locations we'd identified. I mentioned that the initial investment would be approximately $4.2 million, but that the projected returns made it an excellent strategic decision. The conversation around me had gone completely silent. I continued talking to Robert about setting up meetings with the Seattle real estate agents, arranging financing for the expansion, and coordinating with our existing management team to oversee the new locations. I mentioned that I wanted to maintain our commitment to fair wages and employee benefits even as we scaled up operations, because those values were central to what made Santos Organic Markets successful. When I ended the call and turned back to the group, Victoria was staring at me with an expression of complete confusion. Her mouth was slightly open, and she looked like someone had just spoken to her in a foreign language she couldn't comprehend. Amanda and Lisa were exchanging glances that mixed bewilderment with the first hints of embarrassment. Victoria found her voice first, though it came out higher than usual. She asked who I'd been talking to, with the kind of nervous laugh people use when they suspect they've misunderstood something important. I smiled and explained that Robert was my financial advisor, and we'd been discussing some business expansion opportunities that required immediate attention. The word business seemed to short-circuit Victoria's ability to process information. She repeated it like a question, as if she couldn't reconcile the concept with everything she thought she knew about me. I could see her trying to fit this new information into her existing framework of assumptions, but failing completely. That's when David returned with our drinks, immediately sensing the tension in the group. Victoria looked at him with an expression that mixed confusion with something approaching panic, and asked if he knew I had a financial advisor. David looked puzzled by the question and the intensity with which she asked it, but confirmed that yes, he knew I managed some inherited investments, though we hadn't discussed the details extensively. I realized this was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since we met. The truth was going to come out, and it was going to happen in front of the people who had spent 2 years treating me like a gold-digging burden on David's success. I took a deep breath and decided to embrace the revelation rather than minimize it. I told David and the assembled group that there was something I needed to explain about my background, something I probably should have discussed more openly from the beginning. I explained that when my grandmother passed away 4 years earlier, I had inherited her business, Santos Organic Markets, along with the responsibility of continuing her work and values. David's expression shifted from confusion to surprise as I continued explaining. Santos Organic Markets wasn't just a single store, but a chain of 15 locations across Oregon and Washington, employing over 200 people and generating annual revenues that allowed me to live comfortably while pursuing the community work I was passionate about. My volunteer position at the Riverside Community Center wasn't a career necessity, but a personal choice, funded by profits from a business I was proud to continue. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Victoria looked like someone had just explained quantum physics using interpretive dance. Amanda's mouth was literally hanging open. Lisa had gone pale and was staring at me as if I'd just revealed I was actually an alien visitor from another planet. But David's reaction was the one that mattered most, and it was beautifully, perfectly him. After a long moment of processing, he started laughing. Not mockingly or bitterly, but with genuine amusement at the absurdity of the situation. He looked at Victoria and her friends and said he couldn't wait to hear how they planned to explain their concerns about my financial impact on his future. The immediate aftermath was a masterpiece of social awkwardness. Victoria tried to backtrack, claiming she'd always thought there was something special about me and had just been curious about my background. Amanda suddenly remembered how much she'd always admired my dedication to community service. Lisa began talking about how refreshing it was to meet someone so humble about their success. But the damage was done, and we all knew it. These people had spent 2 years treating me with condescension and pity, making assumptions about my worth and my motives, and positioning themselves as superior in every meaningful way. The revelation that I owned more assets than all of them combined had shattered their entire worldview of social hierarchy and personal value. David and I left the party shortly after, walking out into the crisp Portland night with a sense of liberation I hadn't expected. In the car he asked me why I hadn't told him the full extent of my inheritance, and his question came from curiosity rather than hurt. I explained my grandmother's values, my desire to build genuine relationships, and my fear that money would change how people saw me. He understood immediately, which was exactly why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. David was the kind of person who cared more about character than bank accounts, more about dreams than possessions, more about authenticity than image. The revelation didn't change his feelings about me because his feelings had never been based on what I could provide financially. The weeks that followed brought interesting developments at TechFlow Solutions. Victoria's attitude toward me shifted dramatically, from condescending dismissal to uncomfortable attempts at friendship. She began asking about my business, expressing interest in organic food trends, and making comments about how inspiring it was to see young women succeeding in retail. Her transformation was so complete and transparent that it was almost comical. Amanda and Lisa also adjusted their behavior, though their discomfort was more obvious. They began including me in conversations about investments and business strategy, assuming I would now want to participate in their discussions of wealth and status. They seemed genuinely confused when I continued showing more interest in community development than luxury purchases. The most significant change was in how David's colleagues viewed our relationship. Instead of seeing him as someone who had made a questionable romantic choice, they now positioned me as a catch he was lucky to have secured. The same people who had questioned his judgment now praised his ability to attract such a successful partner. It was a perfect illustration of how quickly social dynamics can shift when people's assumptions are challenged. But the experience taught me something important about authenticity and relationship. For 2 years, I had allowed myself to be diminished by people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered. I had watched David question our choices because others had convinced him our lifestyle wasn't impressive enough. I had let fear of judgment prevent me from being completely honest with the person I loved most. The revelation changed our relationship in positive ways. David became a true partner in managing the business, bringing his analytical skills and fresh perspective to strategic decisions. We began making joint choices about philanthropy, expansion, and community involvement. Most importantly, we stopped measuring our success against other people's expectations and started building the life we actually wanted. 6 months later, we opened Santos Organic Markets' 16th location in Southeast Portland, with David serving as the technology consultant who modernized our inventory and customer service systems. Victoria attended the grand opening, praising our commitment to sustainable business practices and community development. Her transformation was complete, but it had revealed something important about the nature of respect and how quickly it can shift when circumstances change. The experience taught me that hiding who you are to avoid judgment ultimately serves no one. The people who would judge you unfairly based on wealth aren't worth protecting, and the people who matter will love you regardless of your bank account. David proved that genuine connection transcends financial considerations, while Victoria and her friends demonstrated how quickly superficial relationships can crumble when assumptions are challenged. Today, Santos Organic Markets continues growing. David has started his own consulting company specializing in retail technology, and we've established a foundation focused on supporting immigrant entrepreneurs in the food industry. We still live modestly by choice, though now it's a conscious decision rather than a performance for others' benefit. The gold digger accusations turned out to be deeply ironic, given that I owned more gold, literal and metaphorical, than my accusers could have imagined. But more importantly, the experience revealed the true gold in my life: authentic relationships, meaningful work, and the confidence to be exactly who I am, regardless of others' expectations. If you've ever been underestimated because of assumptions people made about your background, your choices, or your worth, know that their limitations don't define your reality. Sometimes the most powerful response to judgment is simply living your truth and letting others adjust their perceptions accordingly. And remember, the people who matter will see your value regardless of external markers, while those who don't probably weren't worth knowing anyway. The first few months of married life settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt deceptively natural. David would leave for TechFlow Solutions each morning at 7:30, kissing me goodbye in our small Hawthorne apartment kitchen, while I prepared for another day of what everyone believed was my modest nonprofit work. The irony of our morning routine never lost its sting. While David reviewed code and attended strategy meetings about software projects worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, I would spend my day managing business operations worth millions. My typical day began with coffee and a review of overnight reports from the Santos Organic Markets management team. Each store location sent daily summaries of sales figures, inventory levels, staff issues, and customer feedback. Reading through these reports while sitting at our secondhand dining table still in my pajamas felt surreal. The Belmont location had exceeded its monthly sales target by 18%. The Selwood store was requesting approval to hire 2 additional part-time employees to handle increased customer volume. The newest location in Lake Oswego was struggling with supply chain issues for locally sourced produce. These were the kinds of problems that required immediate attention and strategic thinking, but I handled them through carefully worded emails and phone calls that I scheduled for times when David was safely at work. When he asked about my day over dinner, I would mention my volunteer work at the Riverside Community Center, the financial literacy classes I taught on Thursday evenings, or the community garden project we were developing in partnership with local schools. All of this was true, but it represented perhaps 10% of how I actually spent my time. The community center work provided perfect cover for my real schedule. If I needed to attend a meeting with suppliers or review expansion plans with Robert Hayes, I could easily explain my absence as volunteer commitments or training sessions. The center's director, Patricia Williams, was genuinely grateful for my contributions and never questioned my availability or the resources I was able to bring to various projects. When I arranged for anonymous donations to fund new computer labs or after-school programs, she assumed I was exceptionally good at grant writing rather than personally funding these initiatives. Managing this double life required careful attention to details that most people never consider. I maintained separate phone numbers for business and personal use, with my Santos Organic Markets line forwarded to a service that screened calls during evening hours. My laptop contained 2 completely different sets of bookmarks, email accounts, and document folders. I even carried 2 different business cards, depending on the context in which I might meet someone new. The financial logistics were particularly complex. Santos Organic Markets generated substantial monthly profits that flowed into business accounts managed by Robert Hayes and his team. My personal expenses, which David believed came from my nonprofit salary and small inheritance, were actually funded by carefully planned transfers that appeared to come from various legitimate sources. I had established what amounted to an elaborate financial theater, complete with fake pay stubs, manufactured scholarship notifications, and fabricated family gifts that explained any expenditure that exceeded what a community center coordinator could reasonably afford. David's income covered our rent, utilities, and most of our food expenses, though he didn't realize I was quietly supplementing our grocery budget by shopping exclusively at Santos Organic Markets locations and using my ownership privileges to access wholesale pricing. When he marveled at my ability to find high-quality organic produce at reasonable prices, I would credit my connections in the local food community, rather than revealing that I literally owned the supply chain. Our social life revolved increasingly around David's colleagues, which meant regular exposure to Victoria Adams and her circle of ambitious young professionals. These gatherings were exercises in careful performance, requiring me to maintain my role as someone impressed by their lifestyle choices and grateful for their inclusion. Victoria had taken a particular interest in mentoring me, offering advice about career advancement and professional development that was both condescending and completely irrelevant to my actual situation. During a dinner party at Kevin Thompson's Pearl District apartment, Victoria spent 20 minutes explaining the importance of building professional networks and seeking mentorship from successful women in leadership positions. She offered to introduce me to contacts in the nonprofit sector who might help me advance to better paying positions with more prestigious organizations. Her generosity was genuine, but it was also informed by her assumption that I was struggling financially and professionally in ways that required her intervention. Amanda Foster took a different approach, focusing on personal finance advice that revealed her complete misunderstanding of my circumstances. She recommended budgeting apps, shared articles about side hustles for nonprofit workers, and suggested that David and I consider house sitting or pet sitting to supplement our income. When I politely declined her offer to review our monthly expenses and create a savings plan, she attributed my reluctance to embarrassment about our financial situation rather than the reality that her entire annual salary wouldn't cover my quarterly tax obligations. Lisa Park seemed most concerned about my influence on David's career trajectory. She would make comments about how important it was for ambitious professionals to have supportive partners who understood the demands of success. She worried aloud that David might be limiting his potential by prioritizing work-life balance over advancement opportunities, suggesting that my nonprofit background might not provide adequate perspective on corporate achievement. Her concerns were delivered with such apparent sincerity that David began questioning whether he should be working longer hours or pursuing more aggressive career strategies. These interactions required constant mental translation. When Victoria praised my dedication to serving others despite financial limitations, I had to respond as someone touched by her recognition rather than someone who could fund her favorite charity with pocket change. When Amanda expressed admiration for my ability to find contentment in simple pleasures, I had to appear grateful for her understanding rather than amused by her assumption that I was making sacrifices. When Lisa suggested that David deserved a partner who could contribute more substantially to their shared future, I had to seem hurt rather than entertained by the irony. The most challenging aspect of maintaining this performance was watching how their attitudes affected David. He began comparing our lifestyle to his colleagues' more obviously affluent circumstances and finding it lacking. Our cozy apartment, which we had chosen because we loved the neighborhood and the historic character of the building, started seeming inadequate when measured against Kevin's modern Pearl District loft or Victoria's expansive South Waterfront condominium. Our weekend activities, which typically involved hiking, farmers markets and local cultural events, seemed modest compared to his colleagues' ski trips, wine tastings, and expensive restaurant experiences. David never complained directly, but I could see him calculating costs and making mental adjustments to our lifestyle based on what he thought we could afford on his salary alone. He started suggesting less expensive restaurants for date nights, questioning whether we needed premium cable channels, and expressing concern about our lack of retirement savings. His growing anxiety about our financial future was painful to witness, particularly since our actual financial position was more secure than all of his colleagues combined. The strain of maintaining this deception extended beyond our immediate social circle into every aspect of daily life. When David's parents visited from Seattle, I had to carefully calibrate my responses to their questions about my work, my family background, and our future plans. His mother, Nancy, was particularly skilled at gentle interrogation disguised as motherly interest. She wanted to understand how I could afford to work part-time at a nonprofit, whether my family provided financial support, and what kind of long-term career prospects existed in community development. Nancy's questions weren't malicious, but they came from genuine concern about her son's financial security and partnership choices. She had worked as a financial planner before retiring, and had strong opinions about the importance of dual-income households and strategic career planning. When she learned that I had no immediate plans to pursue full-time employment or advanced education that might lead to higher-paying positions, her disappointment was politely but clearly expressed. David's father, Robert, took a more direct approach, asking about my family's business background and whether I had considered leveraging my nonprofit experience into consulting work or private sector positions. He seemed puzzled by my contentment with volunteer work and small-scale community projects, particularly given what he perceived as my obvious intelligence and capability. His confusion was understandable given that he was seeing someone with clear business acumen choosing to limit her professional development in ways that seemed economically irrational. These conversations with David's family highlighted how my deception was affecting not just our relationship but his entire support network. His parents were beginning to worry that he had married someone who lacked ambition or practical financial sense. His sister Jennifer, who worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company, made pointed comments about the importance of both partners contributing equally to household finances and long-term wealth building. The complexity of maintaining my cover story increased exponentially as our married life became more integrated with David's professional and family circles. I found myself creating increasingly elaborate explanations for financial decisions, lifestyle choices, and time commitments that would have been completely transparent if I had been honest about my circumstances from the beginning. Meanwhile, Santos Organic Markets continued expanding and evolving in ways that required my active involvement despite my efforts to delegate operational responsibilities. The Seattle expansion project was moving forward faster than anticipated, with 3 potential locations identified and preliminary negotiations beginning with property owners. Robert Hayes needed my input on lease terms, renovation budgets, and staffing plans that would determine the success of our entry into the Washington market. The expansion also required coordination with our existing supply chain partners, many of whom had worked with my grandmother for decades and expected personal relationships with ownership. I attended monthly meetings with organic farmers, artisanal food producers, and specialty distributors who knew me as Maria Santos's granddaughter and the continuing force behind the company's commitment to sustainable agriculture and fair trade practices. These meetings often conflicted with activities David had planned or events with his colleagues, requiring me to manufacture explanations for my absence that grew increasingly creative over time. One particularly challenging situation arose when Victoria organized a group outing to a wine tasting event that coincided with a crucial meeting about Santos Organic Markets' partnership with a new organic dairy cooperative. The dairy meeting had been scheduled months in advance and involved farmers who were traveling from Eastern Oregon specifically to discuss exclusive distribution agreements. I couldn't reschedule without damaging important business relationships, but I also couldn't explain my absence to Victoria without revealing information about my actual professional commitments. I ultimately told David that I had committed to facilitating a special workshop at the Community Center for Teenage Entrepreneurs, a program that sounded both plausible and important enough to justify missing the wine tasting. David was disappointed but understanding, praising my dedication to youth development, and promising to take notes about the wines we tasted so I could learn about varieties that might interest me. His supportiveness made my deception even more painful, as I sat in a conference room discussing organic dairy distribution, while he texted me updates about Pinot Noir characteristics and vineyard terroir. The dairy meeting itself was typical of the business responsibilities I was juggling alongside my performance as David's modestly employed wife. The cooperative represented 12 small farms transitioning from conventional to organic dairy production, a process that required significant upfront investment and created financial vulnerability during the 3-year certification period. Santos Organic Markets could provide crucial market stability by committing to purchase their entire organic milk production at premium prices, but this commitment represented a substantial financial obligation that required careful analysis of demand projections and profit margins. As I reviewed spreadsheets showing production capacity, seasonal variations, and quality control standards, I found myself thinking about Victoria's wine tasting commentary that David was relaying through text messages. She was apparently explaining the economic factors that influence different wine regions' market positioning, demonstrating the kind of sophisticated analysis she applied to her own investment decisions. The irony of receiving business insights from someone who had no idea I was simultaneously negotiating deals worth more than her annual salary was not lost on me. The dairy partnership negotiations also highlighted how my grandmother's values continued to guide Santos Organic Markets' business practices in ways that sometimes conflicted with pure profit maximization. The cooperative's farmers were asking for payment terms that exceeded industry standards, requiring us to provide partial payments during the certification transition period when they couldn't yet sell their milk as organic but were incurring organic production costs. From a purely financial perspective, these terms were unnecessary and potentially risky. But my grandmother had built Santos Organic Markets on the principle that sustainable agriculture required supporting farmers through difficult transitions rather than simply seeking the lowest possible supply costs. Her handwritten notes in the margins of old contracts showed her commitment to partnerships that prioritized long-term relationships over short-term savings. Continuing this approach meant accepting lower profit margins in exchange for supply chain stability and alignment with our values, but it also demonstrated why Santos Organic Markets had earned such loyalty from both suppliers and customers over the decades. As I committed to the dairy cooperative's requested terms, I wondered what David would think about this kind of business decision. His software development background emphasized efficiency and optimization in ways that might conflict with the more relationship-focused approach that characterized Santos Organic Markets. Would he understand the value of sacrificing immediate profits to support sustainable agriculture? Would he appreciate the long-term strategic benefits of supplier loyalty, or would he focus on the financial inefficiencies these partnerships created? These questions remained theoretical as long as I maintained my deception, but they highlighted how my dishonesty was preventing David from understanding a fundamental aspect of my identity and values. He knew me as someone committed to community development and social justice, but he had no idea that these commitments extended to business practices that affected hundreds of employees, dozens of suppliers, and thousands of customers across the Pacific Northwest. The success of maintaining my double life depended on careful compartmentalization that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Each day required switching between my role as Rachel the community volunteer and Rachel the business owner, with constant attention to ensuring that information, relationships, and commitments from one identity didn't accidentally spill into the other. The mental energy required for this performance was exhausting, but I had convinced myself it was necessary to protect the authentic relationship David and I had built. However, the strain was beginning to show in small ways that worried me. I sometimes forgot which version of events I had shared with which people, leading to minor inconsistencies that required quick explanations. I occasionally used business terminology or demonstrated knowledge about retail operations that seemed unusually sophisticated for someone whose professional experience was limited to nonprofit work. Most concerning, I was spending increasing amounts of time managing the logistics of deception rather than focusing on either my marriage or my business responsibilities. The community center work, which had begun as genuine volunteer commitment that provided useful cover for my schedule, was beginning to suffer as business demands increased. Patricia Williams had noticed my reduced availability for certain projects and my tendency to schedule volunteer activities around mysterious prior commitments that I couldn't fully explain. While she remained grateful for my contributions, I could see her beginning to question my reliability and wondering whether she should depend less heavily on my involvement in future initiatives. Similarly, my attention to Santos Organic Markets was becoming fragmented in ways that concerned Robert Hayes and the management team. I was missing details in reports, asking for information to be repeated, and making decisions more slowly than usual. The business was successful enough to absorb these inefficiencies temporarily, but the trajectory was unsustainable if I continued dividing my focus between maintaining my deception and fulfilling my actual responsibilities. David remained oblivious to these growing tensions, which was both a relief and a source of additional stress. His continued trust in my explanations and acceptance of my schedule constraints demonstrated the strength of our relationship, but it also highlighted how my dishonesty was taking advantage of his love and respect for me. He deserved a partner who could share her complete self with him, not someone who was performing an elaborate charade to avoid difficult conversations about wealth, values, and identity. The approaching holidays brought additional complications as both families planned visits, and David's colleagues organized seasonal social events that would require more intensive performance of my modest lifestyle. Victoria had mentioned hosting a New Year's Eve party that would include TechFlow's senior management and their spouses, creating an opportunity for David to network with decision-makers who could influence his career advancement. My presence at such an event would be expected, but it would also place me in direct contact with sophisticated business professionals who might ask more probing questions about my background and current activities. As December approached, I found myself facing a decision point that I had been postponing for months. The complexity of maintaining my deception was increasing at the same rate as the potential consequences of discovery. David's career was advancing in ways that would require more social integration with his professional community, while Santos Organic Markets was expanding in ways that demanded more of my time and attention. The intersection of these trajectories was creating pressure that would eventually force the truth into the open, whether I planned for it or not. The question was no longer whether to reveal my true circumstances to David and his colleagues, but when and how to do so in a way that minimized damage to our relationship and his professional standing. The gold digger accusations that had begun as annoying assumptions were crystallizing into a narrative that could become increasingly difficult to dispel as time passed and the deception deepened. But first, I had to navigate the immediate challenges of the holiday season while maintaining the increasingly fragile performance that had become my daily reality. The first crack in my carefully constructed facade appeared on a rainy Tuesday morning in November, when David casually mentioned that Victoria had been asking questions about my family's financial history. He brought it up while we were sharing coffee and scanning news headlines before work, treating it as an amusing curiosity rather than the warning signal it actually represented. Victoria had apparently been wondering how my grandmother could have afforded to leave me even a modest inheritance, given what she assumed were the limited earning potential of immigrant families in the grocery business during the 1970s and 80s. David found her curiosity mildly intrusive but ultimately harmless, the kind of personal interest that ambitious people sometimes developed about their colleagues' private lives. He had deflected her questions by explaining that he didn't know many details about my family's finances, which was technically true even if it missed the enormous scope of what he didn't know. But Victoria's interest in my background suggested she was beginning to notice inconsistencies between my supposed circumstances and my actual behavior, inconsistencies that I had been hoping would remain invisible to casual observation. The questions Victoria was asking revealed a level of attention to detail that made me profoundly uncomfortable. She wanted to know how my grandmother had managed to save enough money to provide meaningful financial support to her granddaughter, while operating what appeared to be a single small grocery store in an era when such businesses typically generated subsistence-level income for their owners. She was curious about whether my family had other business interests or investment activities that might explain their apparent financial stability. Most concerning, she was beginning to research property records and business registrations that might shed light on my family's actual economic history. This development forced me to confront the reality that my deception was built on foundations that could not withstand serious scrutiny from someone with both motivation to investigate and access to professional research resources. Victoria's position at TechFlow Solutions gave her experience in due diligence and competitive analysis that she could easily apply to personal curiosity about her colleagues' backgrounds. If she decided to pursue her questions about my family's finances with the same thoroughness she brought to business projects, she would quickly discover information that would expose the entire structure of lies I had constructed. The immediate challenge was determining how much Victoria already knew, and whether her curiosity represented casual interest or deliberate investigation. David's casual reporting of her questions suggested he viewed them as social conversation rather than reconnaissance, but I couldn't assume that Victoria was limiting her inquiry to what she discussed openly with my husband. Her professional background included skills in information gathering and analysis that she might be applying privately to questions that social conventions prevented her from asking directly. I spent the following days carefully monitoring David's reports of office interactions for any additional signs that Victoria was pursuing her investigation into my background. She had apparently shifted her attention to questions about my current financial management, wondering how I could afford to work part-time at a nonprofit while living in Hawthorne and maintaining what appeared to be a comfortable lifestyle. These questions were more dangerous than her historical curiosity because they focused on inconsistencies in my present circumstances that David might begin noticing if Victoria's observations made him more attentive to our household economics. The timing of Victoria's increased scrutiny was particularly problematic because it coincided with several business developments that required my direct involvement in ways that would be difficult to explain if discovered. The Seattle expansion project was entering a critical phase that required site visits, contractor meetings, and coordination with regulatory agencies that had specific requirements for organic food retail operations. These activities took place during normal business hours when David assumed I was either volunteering at the community center or managing my limited nonprofit responsibilities. Additionally, Santos Organic Markets was implementing a new inventory management system across all locations, a technological upgrade that required my approval for substantial software licensing costs and staff training programs. The project involved consultation with multiple vendors, evaluation of competing systems, and coordination with store managers, who needed to understand how the changes would affect their daily operations. Robert Hayes could handle many of these decisions independently, but the strategic implications required input from ownership in ways that demanded more of my time and attention than I could easily hide. The inventory system upgrade also created an unexpected exposure risk when David mentioned at dinner that TechFlow Solutions had recently completed a similar project for a regional retail chain. His enthusiasm for discussing the technical challenges and implementation strategies they had developed made me realize how much professional insight he could offer to Santos Organic Markets if he knew about my involvement in the business. His expertise in software integration and user experience design would be tremendously valuable for our modernization efforts, but accessing his knowledge would require revealing information about my circumstances that I was still trying to conceal.
Situation became more complex when David mentioned that Victoria had offered to mentor him in developing a more aggressive career advancement strategy. She had suggested that ambitious professionals needed to make strategic decisions about personal relationships, professional associations, and lifestyle choices that supported their long-term goals rather than limiting their potential. While she hadn't criticized our marriage directly, her advice contained clear implications that partners should contribute to career advancement rather than creating additional financial responsibilities. Victoria's mentoring approach was particularly insidious because it appeared to be genuinely helpful while actually serving her own interests and positioning herself as a more suitable partner for David's professional trajectory. She was demonstrating her understanding of business strategy, her commitment to success, and her ability to support ambitious career goals in ways that highlighted what she perceived as my limitations. Her advice was creating doubt in David's mind about whether our relationship was aligned with his professional development or representing an obstacle to his advancement. These dynamics were playing out against the backdrop of TechFlow Solutions' annual performance review process, which would determine salary adjustments, promotion opportunities, and project assignments for the following year. David was hoping for recognition that would lead to senior developer responsibilities and corresponding financial rewards, but he was competing against colleagues who appeared to have fewer personal constraints and more flexibility to pursue advancement opportunities. Victoria had made it clear that she viewed his marriage to someone with limited earning potential as a strategic disadvantage that could affect his career trajectory. The performance review process also created additional pressure for social integration with TechFlow's senior management, who evaluated employees not just on technical competence but on their cultural fit and leadership potential. David's colleagues were organizing networking events, social gatherings, and informal meetings designed to increase their visibility with decision makers who would influence promotion decisions. These activities required spouses and partners to participate in ways that demonstrated their support for the company culture and their compatibility with TechFlow's professional community. My participation in these networking activities was becoming increasingly problematic as my supposed background came under more scrutiny from people with sophisticated business experience. TechFlow's senior management included individuals with extensive experience in mergers and acquisitions, strategic planning, and competitive analysis who could easily identify inconsistencies in my story if they became interested in investigating my circumstances. Their casual questions about my work, my family background, and my perspectives on business development carried implications that went far beyond social conversation. During a cocktail reception for employees and their spouses, I found myself in an extended conversation with Margaret Chen, TechFlow's Vice President of Strategic Development, who shared my interest in sustainable agriculture and local food systems. Her questions about my community development work quickly evolved into sophisticated discussion of supply chain management, organic certification processes, and retail market dynamics that revealed far more knowledge about the food industry than someone with my supposed background should possess. Margaret's professional experience included consulting work with agricultural cooperatives and organic food distributors, giving her expertise that made it difficult for me to maintain my performance as someone whose knowledge came from volunteer work rather than business ownership. She was clearly intrigued by my insights into organic retail operations and began asking questions about specific companies and industry relationships that I couldn't answer without revealing my connection to Santos Organic Markets. Our conversation ended with her expressing interest in continuing our discussion and potentially involving me in TechFlow's pro bono consulting work with nonprofit organizations in the food sector. This interaction represented exactly the kind of exposure risk that I had been trying to avoid through careful management of my social connections and professional relationships. Margaret's offer to involve me in consulting work would require background verification and professional references that would inevitably lead to discovery of my actual circumstances. Her interest in my knowledge and insights was flattering, but it also demonstrated how difficult it was becoming to maintain my deception in environments where my actual expertise was both relevant and valuable. The Margaret Chen conversation also highlighted how my dishonesty was affecting David's professional opportunities in ways I hadn't anticipated. Her obvious interest in my background and knowledge could have opened doors for both of us if I had been honest about my circumstances. TechFlow Solutions was actively seeking partnerships with sustainable businesses and social impact organizations that aligned with their corporate values, and Santos Organic Markets would be an ideal candidate for collaboration if I could acknowledge my connection to the company. Instead, I was forced to deflect opportunities that could benefit David's career while simultaneously trying to avoid exposure that would reveal my deception. This balancing act was becoming increasingly unsustainable as my actual expertise became more apparent to people with the professional background to recognize and value it. The very qualities that made me an attractive partner for David also made me interesting to his colleagues in ways that created exposure risks I couldn't effectively manage. The pressure of maintaining my performance was also beginning to affect my decision-making at Santos Organic Markets in ways that concerned Robert Hayes and the management team. I was avoiding meetings and strategic discussions that might conflict with David's schedule or social expectations, leading to delays in important business decisions and missed opportunities for operational improvements. The Seattle expansion project was falling behind schedule because I couldn't attend site visits and vendor meetings that conflicted with my supposed community center responsibilities or David's expectations for my availability. Robert had begun asking pointed questions about my reduced engagement with business operations and my tendency to postpone decisions that required immediate attention. While he respected my desire to maintain work-life balance, he was concerned that my decreased involvement was creating bottlenecks that could affect the company's performance and growth trajectory. The management team needed clear direction on expansion strategies, staffing decisions, and operational changes that required ownership input, but my divided attention was making it difficult to provide the leadership they needed. The most troubling development was my growing tendency to make business decisions based on their compatibility with my deception rather than their merit for Santos Organic Markets. I was avoiding partnerships, vendor relationships, and expansion opportunities that might create scheduling conflicts or exposure risks even when these opportunities represented significant value for the company. My grandmother had built Santos Organic Markets by prioritizing long-term strategic thinking over short-term convenience, but I was doing the opposite by allowing personal considerations to override business judgment. This deterioration in my business leadership was particularly frustrating because Santos Organic Markets was performing exceptionally well despite my reduced engagement. The management team my grandmother had assembled was executing daily operations with remarkable efficiency while our customer base continued expanding and our supplier relationships remained strong. The company's success was creating opportunities for growth and innovation that required strategic vision and ownership commitment, but I was too distracted by maintaining my deception to provide the leadership the business deserved. The contrast between Santos Organic Markets' potential and my diminished engagement became especially apparent during our quarterly review meeting, where store managers presented data showing consistent growth across all locations and identified opportunities for further expansion. The Belmont location was generating demand that exceeded their physical capacity, suggesting the need for additional space or a second location in Southeast Portland. The Lake Oswego store had developed such strong relationships with local suppliers that we could potentially launch a wholesale distribution business serving other organic retailers in the region. These opportunities represented exactly the kind of strategic growth that my grandmother would have pursued aggressively, but I found myself hesitating because of the time and attention they would require. Expansion decisions needed thorough market analysis, site selection, financing arrangements, and regulatory compliance that would demand weeks of meetings and research that I couldn't easily explain away as volunteer commitments. The wholesale distribution opportunity would require even more intensive development, including legal agreements, logistics planning, and relationship building that would be impossible to hide from David. As I listened to the management team's presentations and recognized the potential they were identifying, I realized that my deception was not just affecting my marriage but also preventing me from fulfilling my responsibilities to the employees, suppliers, and customers who depended on Santos Organic Markets for their livelihoods and community connections. My grandmother had entrusted me with continuing her work not just as a business owner but as a community leader who supported sustainable agriculture and economic development. My inability to engage fully with these responsibilities because of personal dishonesty represented a betrayal of her legacy that was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. The weight of these competing obligations was creating stress that began manifesting in ways that David couldn't help but notice. I was sleeping poorly, becoming distracted during conversations, and showing signs of anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the community center work that he believed was my primary source of professional pressure. When he asked about my apparent stress, I had to manufacture explanations about volunteer responsibilities and nonprofit funding challenges that added additional layers to my deception while failing to address the actual sources of my concern. David's growing awareness of my stress created another complication because it prompted him to offer support and assistance that I couldn't accept without revealing information about my real circumstances. He suggested helping me develop more efficient systems for managing my volunteer work, offered to accompany me to community center events to provide technical assistance, and even proposed reducing our social commitments with his colleagues to give me more time for activities that seemed to be causing me stress. His supportive responses to my apparent difficulties made my continued deception even more painful, as I was taking advantage of his love and concern to maintain lies that were preventing us from addressing our actual challenges as partners. The situation reached a critical point when David suggested that we might need to reconsider our financial planning to account for what appeared to be increased demands on my time and energy. He was concerned that my volunteer work was becoming overwhelming and wondered whether we should explore ways for him to increase his income so that I could reduce my commitments and focus on activities that brought me more satisfaction. His willingness to take on additional professional responsibilities to support what he perceived as my career struggles represented exactly the kind of partnership I valued most, but it was based on completely inaccurate understanding of our circumstances. As winter approached and TechFlow Solutions prepared for their annual holiday celebrations, I knew that the convergence of increased social obligations, business demands, and David's career concerns would soon create pressure that would force resolution of the contradictions I had been managing through careful performance and strategic deception. The early warning signs were becoming too numerous and too obvious to ignore, and the cost of maintaining my false identity was beginning to exceed its benefits for everyone involved. The question was no longer whether my deception would be discovered, but whether I would choose to reveal the truth proactively or wait for circumstances to expose it in ways that I couldn't control. The Christmas party at the Nines Hotel marked the end of everything I thought I understood about maintaining secrets and managing relationships. Walking into that elegant ballroom, I had no idea that within 2 hours I would voluntarily destroy the carefully constructed identity I had spent 4 years perfecting. The evening began exactly as I had expected, with Victoria Adams holding court near the champagne fountain, her designer dress catching the light as she orchestrated conversations that would advance her professional agenda while subtly undermining anyone she perceived as competition. David looked handsome in his navy suit, the one we had purchased together at Nordstrom Rack 6 months earlier when he received his promotion to senior developer. He moved through the crowd with genuine enthusiasm, introducing me to colleagues I hadn't met and reconnecting with acquaintances from other departments. His pride in our relationship was evident in every interaction, which made the whispered conversations I overheard even more painful to witness. The ballroom itself was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over round tables dressed in white linens and gold accents. TechFlow Solutions had spared no expense for their annual celebration, hiring a jazz quartet, providing premium liquor, and creating an atmosphere that emphasized the company's success and sophistication. The guest list included not just employees but also clients, investors, and community leaders who represented potential business opportunities for the growing tech firm. I had chosen my outfit with particular care, selecting a midnight blue dress that I had discovered at a consignment boutique in the Pearl District. The dress was actually a vintage Armani piece from the early 2000s, beautifully tailored and made from silk that felt luxurious against my skin. I paired it with my grandmother's diamond earrings, the only obviously expensive jewelry I owned, and carried a small clutch that complemented the dress without drawing attention to itself. To the assembled crowd, I probably looked like someone who had made the best possible choices within obvious budget constraints. The first hour passed pleasantly enough, with David introducing me to TechFlow's senior management and me engaging in conversations about community development, sustainable business practices, and the challenges facing nonprofit organizations in an increasingly competitive funding environment. These discussions felt natural and authentic, allowing me to share genuine insights about issues I cared deeply about while carefully avoiding any information that might reveal the true extent of my involvement in business operations. Margaret Chen, the Vice President of Strategic Development, whom I had met at the previous networking event, sought me out specifically to continue our conversation about organic food systems and sustainable agriculture. Her questions were more probing than before, revealing her continued interest in my knowledge and possibly her suspicions about the source of my expertise. She mentioned that TechFlow was considering partnerships with environmentally conscious businesses and wondered whether I might know of organizations that would be appropriate candidates for collaboration. The conversation with Margaret was simultaneously engaging and terrifying, as she demonstrated the kind of sophisticated understanding of business strategy that made it difficult to maintain my performance as someone whose knowledge came from volunteer work rather than ownership experience. She asked about specific organic certification processes, supply chain challenges, and retail market dynamics that I could only answer accurately by drawing on my experience managing Santos Organic Markets. Each response I gave provided her with additional information that could eventually lead to discovery of my true circumstances if she decided to investigate further. Meanwhile, Victoria was orchestrating her own agenda across the ballroom, moving strategically between groups and positioning herself for maximum visibility with the senior executives who would influence promotion decisions and project assignments. I watched her work the room with grudging admiration for her political skills, even as I recognized that her success often came at the expense of colleagues she viewed as competition or obstacles to her advancement. David was networking with his usual genuine enthusiasm, discussing technical challenges and innovative solutions with colleagues who shared his passion for software development. I could see him enjoying the professional conversations and the opportunity to demonstrate his expertise to people who could influence his career trajectory. His happiness made me more determined to avoid any situation that might embarrass him or damage his standing with his colleagues, even though I was beginning to realize that my continued deception might ultimately cause more harm than honest revelation. The evening's tone shifted dramatically when I overheard a conversation that Victoria was having with Amanda Foster and Lisa Park near the dessert table. They had positioned themselves where they could observe the entire ballroom while speaking in voices low enough to avoid being overheard by anyone except someone who happened to be standing directly behind the elaborate floral arrangement that separated us. Victoria was explaining her theory about my relationship with David, a theory that had apparently evolved considerably since our last social interaction. She had concluded that I was deliberately presenting myself as financially modest while actually having access to resources that I was concealing for strategic reasons. Her evidence included my knowledge of business operations, my apparent comfort in professional social situations, and what she described as inconsistencies between my supposed circumstances and my actual behavior. Amanda and Lisa were fascinated by Victoria's analysis, asking questions that revealed their own observations about my lifestyle choices and social interactions. They had noticed that I never seemed genuinely concerned about money despite supposedly working part-time at a nonprofit. They had observed that my clothes, while not obviously expensive, were consistently well-made and perfectly fitted in ways that suggested either exceptional thrift shopping skills or access to better quality items than my supposed budget should allow. Most disturbing was Lisa's observation that I seemed to have extensive knowledge about retail operations, supply chain management, and customer service strategies that seemed unusually sophisticated for someone whose professional experience was limited to community development work. She had been researching organic food businesses as potential investment opportunities and had been impressed by insights I had shared during casual conversations about industry trends and operational challenges. The three women had constructed a narrative about my motivations that was both completely wrong and uncomfortably close to the truth. They believed I was concealing wealth in order to test David's commitment to our relationship, manipulating him into believing he was supporting me financially while actually being financially independent. Victoria described this as a sophisticated form of gold digging that involved psychological manipulation rather than direct financial exploitation. Their analysis painted me as calculating and deceptive in ways that were personally insulting, even though their underlying assumptions about my financial circumstances were accurate. They saw my community center work as an elaborate performance designed to appear virtuous while concealing my true nature as someone who used money and deception to control relationships. Victoria was particularly harsh in her assessment, describing me as the kind of woman who destroyed men's confidence and independence through emotional manipulation disguised as modesty and dedication to social causes. Listening to this character assassination was painful enough, but what made it unbearable was their conclusion that David deserved to know the truth about what they perceived as my deceptive nature. Victoria was planning to approach him privately to share her concerns about my authenticity and suggest that he investigate my background more thoroughly. She believed she was protecting him from someone who was taking advantage of his honest nature and generous spirit. The irony of Victoria positioning herself as David's protector while simultaneously pursuing her own romantic interest in him was not lost on me, but her stated intention to expose what she saw as my deception forced me to confront the reality that my secret was no longer sustainable. Whether her investigation revealed the truth about my financial circumstances or simply convinced David that I was hiding something significant, the outcome would be the end of the relationship I had worked so hard to protect through careful deception. As I stood behind that floral arrangement, listening to three women dissect my character and motivations with surgical precision, I realized that I had reached the moment my grandmother would have called a point of truth. Maria Santos had built her business on the principle that authentic relationships required honest communication, even when honesty was difficult or risky. She had taught me that deception always carried costs that exceeded its benefits, and that the temporary comfort of avoiding difficult conversations inevitably led to more serious problems that were harder to resolve. The choice I faced was whether to allow Victoria to control the narrative about my circumstances or to take responsibility for revealing the truth in my own words and on my own terms. David deserved to learn about my financial situation from me rather than from someone whose motivations were suspect and whose understanding of our relationship was based on observation rather than intimacy. More importantly, I deserved the opportunity to explain my choices and motivations rather than having them interpreted by people who had never understood my values or priorities. I walked away from that conversation knowing that my performance as Rachel, the modest nonprofit worker, would end that evening, but uncertain about how to transition into honesty without destroying the relationship I had been trying to protect. The challenge was finding a way to reveal my circumstances that demonstrated respect for David's intelligence and integrity while acknowledging the mistakes I had made in concealing information that affected our partnership. The opportunity came when Victoria approached David directly, positioning herself between him and a group of colleagues in a way that created a semi-private conversation space. I watched from across the room as she leaned in close, speaking with the kind of intensity that suggested she was sharing information she considered both important and confidential. David's expression shifted from polite attention to confusion and then to something that looked like concern as Victoria continued her explanation. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I stood, but David's body language told me everything I needed to know. Victoria was sharing her suspicions about my authenticity and her belief that I was deceiving him about fundamental aspects of my identity and circumstances. David was listening with the kind of focused attention he brought to complex technical problems, processing information that challenged his assumptions about our relationship and my character. When Victoria finished speaking, David looked across the ballroom until he found me standing near the windows that overlooked the city lights. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and I saw in his expression a mixture of confusion, hurt, and something that might have been disappointment. He excused himself from Victoria's continued commentary and walked directly toward me, moving with purpose that suggested he intended to address whatever concerns she had raised. Rather than wait for David to confront me with Victoria's accusations and force me into a defensive position, I decided to take control of the situation by revealing the truth proactively. I pulled out my phone and dialed Robert Hayes's direct number, knowing that he would answer immediately despite the late hour because he understood that ownership calls took priority over personal convenience. Robert answered on the second ring, and I could hear the background noise of his own holiday party as he stepped away to take my call. I explained that I needed to discuss the Santos Organic Markets expansion timeline because I was ready to move forward with the Seattle project more aggressively than we had originally planned. I mentioned specific dollar amounts for property acquisitions, renovation budgets, and staffing costs that reflected the scale of investment we were considering. The conversation was brief but comprehensive, covering enough business details to make it clear that I was discussing matters that required ownership-level authority and financial commitment. I made sure to reference the specific locations we were considering, the suppliers we needed to coordinate with, and the regulatory approvals that would be required for expansion into the Washington market. When I ended the call, I had provided anyone within hearing distance with enough information to understand that I was involved in business operations that required millions of dollars in capital investment. David had arrived at my side during the phone conversation, and I could see him processing the implications of what he was hearing. The confusion in his expression was giving way to recognition as he began to understand that the woman he had married possessed financial resources and business responsibilities that she had never discussed with him. Victoria, Amanda, and Lisa had also positioned themselves within hearing distance, their expressions shifting from smug satisfaction to bewilderment as they realized that their assumptions about my circumstances were fundamentally incorrect. When I finished the call and turned to face the assembled group, I knew that there was no possibility of returning to the comfortable deception I had maintained for 4 years. The truth was now in the open, and the only question was how
To explain my motivations and choices in a way that preserved the relationships that mattered most to me while acknowledging the mistakes I had made in concealing information that affected everyone involved. David was the first to speak, asking simply who I had been talking to and what business I was discussing with such obvious authority. His question was direct but not accusatory, reflecting his genuine desire to understand rather than his need to confront or embarrass me. I appreciated his instinctive respect for my dignity even as he grappled with the realization that his wife had been living a completely different life than the one he thought they shared. I explained that Robert Hayes was my financial advisor and that we had been discussing the expansion of Santos Organic Markets, the business I had inherited from my grandmother 4 years earlier. I described the company as a chain of 15 organic grocery stores across Oregon and Washington that generated substantial profits and employed over 200 people in communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. I acknowledged that the business required active management and strategic decision-making that I had been handling privately while maintaining my volunteer work at the community center. The explanation was factual but incomplete, focusing on the business aspects of my hidden life while avoiding the more complex emotional and psychological reasons that had motivated my deception. David needed more information to understand not just what I had been doing but why I had chosen to conceal it from him, and the public setting of the Christmas party was not appropriate for the kind of detailed conversation that would be required to address his legitimate questions and concerns. Victoria was the first to recover from her shock, though her attempt to process this new information was complicated by the complete collapse of her theory about my motivations and character. She had been so convinced that I was deceiving David about my financial dependence that she struggled to adjust to the reality that I was actually financially independent in ways that exceeded her own professional success. Her stammered questions about how long I had owned the business and why I had never mentioned it revealed her difficulty in reconciling her assumptions with the facts I was presenting. Amanda and Lisa were similarly confused, having invested considerable time and social capital in treating me as someone whose circumstances required their pity and condescension.
The revelation that I was actually more successful than any of them forced them to reconsider not just their assessment of my character but also their own behavior toward me over the past 2 years. Their discomfort was obvious as they realized that their charitable attitudes and helpful suggestions had been based on completely inaccurate assumptions about my needs and capabilities. But the person whose reaction mattered most was David, and his response exceeded my most optimistic expectations. After processing the basic facts about my business ownership, he began to smile with what appeared to be genuine amusement at the situation. He looked at Victoria and her companions and asked how they planned to explain their concern about my negative financial impact on his future, given that I apparently owned more assets than all of them combined. David's ability to find humor in the revelation while maintaining respect for my privacy and dignity demonstrated exactly why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. He understood intuitively that my deception had been motivated by something more complex than simple dishonesty, and he was willing to reserve judgment about my choices until we could discuss them privately. His response also suggested that he was more amused than hurt by the discovery that his wife was wealthy, which indicated a level of emotional security that made me optimistic about our ability to work through the complications my deception had created. The immediate aftermath of my revelation was a masterpiece of social awkwardness as Victoria, Amanda, and Lisa attempted to adjust their behavior to reflect the new reality of my circumstances. Victoria's transformation was particularly dramatic as she shifted from condescending concern to effusive praise for my business acumen and community leadership. She began asking questions about Santos Organic Markets with obvious interest in potential business connections, seemingly oblivious to the irony of seeking opportunities with someone she had been criticizing moments earlier. Amanda and Lisa followed Victoria's lead in attempting to reposition themselves as supportive colleagues rather than charitable advisors, but their discomfort was more obvious as they struggled to find ways to interact with me that didn't reference their previous assumptions about my circumstances. Their attempts at conversation were stilted and artificial, revealing their uncertainty about how to relate to someone whose actual status was so different from what they had believed. The broader party continued around us, with most guests unaware of the drama that had unfolded near the windows overlooking downtown Portland. David and I excused ourselves from Victoria's increasingly desperate attempts to demonstrate her newfound respect for my success, and we found a quiet corner where we could begin the conversation that would determine the future of our relationship. David's first question was why I had felt the need to conceal my business ownership and financial independence, and whether my deception indicated fundamental problems with trust and communication in our marriage. His concern was legitimate and his approach was respectful, focusing on understanding my motivations rather than attacking my character or questioning my love for him. I appreciated his willingness to listen before judging, even though I knew that my explanation would need to be comprehensive and convincing to address the damage my secrecy had caused. I explained my grandmother's influence on my values and my desire to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than financial consideration. I described my experiences with people who had changed their behavior toward me after learning about my inheritance, and my fear that wealth would attract people who were interested in my resources rather than my personality. I acknowledged that my deception had been unfair to David and had prevented us from making joint decisions about our future that reflected our actual circumstances rather than imaginary constraints. David listened carefully to my explanation, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his genuine effort to understand my perspective while also expressing his concerns about the impact my secrecy had had on our relationship and his career decisions. He pointed out that his assumptions about our financial situation had influenced his professional choices in ways that might have limited his potential, and that my deception had prevented him from offering support and expertise that could have benefited both my business and our partnership. The conversation continued for over an hour as we worked through the immediate questions and concerns that my revelation had created. David was hurt that I had not trusted him with information that affected our marriage, but he was also beginning to understand the complexity of my situation and the difficulty of finding the right moment and method for sharing such significant news. His response was more generous and understanding than I had dared to hope, though I knew that rebuilding trust would require time and consistent honesty moving forward. We left the Christmas party with a sense of relief that the truth was finally in the open, even though we both understood that addressing the implications of my deception would require ongoing conversation and mutual effort. David's colleagues now knew that their assumptions about our relationship had been incorrect, which eliminated the social pressure that had been affecting his professional interactions and my comfort at company events. The weeks following the Christmas party brought significant changes to both our personal relationship and our professional circumstances. David became actively involved in Santos Organic Markets' technology modernization efforts, bringing his software development expertise to bear on challenges that had been consuming significant time and resources. His contributions were immediately valuable, and his enthusiasm for the work demonstrated how much he had missed having opportunities to apply his skills to projects that aligned with his values. Victoria's behavior toward me underwent a complete transformation, shifting from subtle hostility to obvious attempts at professional networking and social connection. She began inviting me to lunch meetings where she shared her own career ambitions and expressed interest in potential business collaborations between TechFlow Solutions and Santos Organic Markets. Her change in attitude was transparently motivated by my revealed circumstances, but I appreciated that she was at least making an effort to repair the relationship damage her previous behavior had caused. Amanda and Lisa also adjusted their interactions with me, though their discomfort with the situation remained obvious months later. They struggled to find ways to relate to me that didn't reference their previous assumptions about my circumstances, and their conversations with me became stilted and artificial as they attempted to navigate the social awkwardness their misconceptions had created. Most importantly, David and I began functioning as true partners in both our personal relationship and our professional endeavors. He provided valuable perspective on business strategy and operational efficiency, while I was able to support his entrepreneurial ambitions with both financial resources and business experience. Our relationship became stronger and more authentic as we learned to communicate honestly about our goals, concerns, and dreams without the artificial constraints that my deception had created. The experience taught me that authenticity in relationships requires courage to be vulnerable with people who matter, even when that vulnerability creates risk of rejection or misunderstanding. My grandmother's values had been correct about the importance of honest communication, but I had misapplied her wisdom by using deception to protect relationships rather than using honesty to build them on solid foundations. 6 months after the Christmas party revelation, David and I celebrated the opening of Santos Organic Markets' 17th location, a flagship store in downtown Seattle that represented our successful expansion into the Washington market. The store featured innovative technology solutions that David had designed, sustainable design elements that reflected our environmental values, and community programming that honored my grandmother's commitment to supporting local food systems. Victoria attended the grand opening celebration, praising our business model and expressing admiration for our partnership in ways that demonstrated her complete reversal from her previous assessment of our relationship. Her presence was a reminder of how quickly people's perceptions can change when circumstances challenge their assumptions, and how important it is to base relationships on authentic understanding rather than superficial observations. The gold digger accusations that had motivated Victoria's investigation turned out to be profoundly ironic, given that I owned significantly more assets than anyone who had questioned my motivations. But more importantly, the experience revealed the true value in my life, a relationship built on genuine love and respect, meaningful work that honored my family's legacy, and the confidence to be exactly who I am, regardless of others' expectations or assumptions. Today, Santos Organic Markets continues to grow under our joint leadership. David has launched his own consulting firm specializing in sustainable retail technology, and we have established educational programs that teach young entrepreneurs about building businesses that serve their communities while generating sustainable profits. We live authentically as partners who support each other's dreams while maintaining the values that brought us together. The lesson I learned is that hiding who you are to protect relationships ultimately serves no one. The people who would judge you unfairly based on wealth or status aren't worth the effort of deception, while those who truly matter will love and respect you for exactly who you are. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is trust the people you love with your complete truth, even when that truth challenges their assumptions or forces difficult conversations about identity, values, and expectations. The morning after Thanksgiving brought an unexpected phone call that would accelerate every conflict I had been carefully managing for months. Robert Hayes called at 6:30 in the morning, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately commanded my attention despite the early hour. A major organic food distributor in California had approached him about acquiring Santos Organic Markets, offering a preliminary figure that exceeded $20 million for the entire operation. The potential buyers wanted to schedule meetings within the next 2 weeks to discuss terms, evaluate our operations, and present their vision for expanding our brand throughout the West Coast. The acquisition offer represented an opportunity that my grandmother would have considered carefully, not because she needed the money, but because it might serve the broader mission of promoting sustainable agriculture and ethical business practices. The California company had built an impressive reputation for maintaining the values and operational standards of the businesses they acquired, often providing resources for expansion that individual owners couldn't access independently. Their interest in Santos Organic Markets suggested recognition of what we had built and confidence in our potential for greater impact. However, the timing of this offer created immediate complications that threatened to expose every aspect of my carefully maintained deception. The evaluation process would require extensive documentation of our financial performance, operational systems, and strategic planning that I couldn't provide without spending substantial time in meetings with attorneys, accountants, and business analysts. The California team wanted to visit our locations, interview our management staff, and review our supplier relationships in ways that would demand my presence and attention for weeks. Robert explained that declining to participate in the evaluation process would likely end their interest, since serious buyers expected ownership to be actively engaged in due diligence activities. The acquisition discussions also came with strict confidentiality requirements that would prevent me from explaining my unavailability to David or his colleagues without violating the non-disclosure agreements that governed our negotiations. I was faced with either participating fully in a process that would make maintaining my secret impossible, or walking away from an opportunity that could significantly advance the mission my grandmother had entrusted to me. The California company's interest had been sparked by our reputation in the sustainable agriculture community and our consistent financial performance over the past decade. Their research had revealed that Santos Organic Markets had achieved growth rates and profit margins that exceeded industry standards while maintaining employee satisfaction levels and community engagement that demonstrated genuine commitment to our stated values. They saw us as an ideal addition to their portfolio of purpose-driven businesses that prioritize social impact alongside financial returns. The initial offer included provisions for retaining our existing management team, maintaining our supplier relationships, and preserving the community programs that distinguish Santos Organic Markets from typical grocery chains. The acquiring company would provide capital for aggressive expansion while allowing us to maintain operational independence and continue the practices that had made us successful. For someone genuinely committed to expanding access to organic food and supporting sustainable agriculture, the offer represented almost everything I could want for my grandmother's legacy. But accepting their offer would require revealing my business ownership to David in circumstances that would make my years of deception appear even more problematic. The acquisition process would involve lawyers, accountants, and business consultants who would need to communicate with me directly about matters that affected millions of dollars in assets and hundreds of jobs. David would inevitably discover that his wife had been managing complex business negotiations while pretending to work part-time at a community center, and he would learn this information at the same time as everyone else, rather than through honest conversation between partners. The situation became more complicated when Robert mentioned that the California company had specifically requested meeting with me personally, rather than relying entirely on management presentations and financial documentation. They wanted to understand my vision for Santos Organic Markets' future, my commitment to the values that guided our operations, and my perspective on how acquisition might serve our mission more effectively than continued independent operation. These conversations would require me to demonstrate knowledge and expertise that I had been hiding from everyone in my personal life, including the man I had promised to share everything with in marriage. I asked Robert to delay scheduling any meetings until I could resolve the personal complications that the acquisition discussions would create, but he explained that the California company was evaluating several potential acquisitions simultaneously and wanted to move quickly on the opportunities that interested them most. Delaying our response might signal lack of serious interest and could result in their focusing attention on other businesses that were more immediately available for negotiations. The compressed timeline meant that I had perhaps a week to decide whether to pursue the acquisition or maintain my deception, but not enough time to do both. The weight of this decision was complicated by my growing awareness that David was becoming increasingly frustrated with constraints he believed were imposed by our limited household income. His conversations over Thanksgiving weekend had revealed his desire to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities that would allow him greater creative control and potential financial rewards than his position at TechFlow Solutions could provide. He had been researching the possibility of starting his own consulting practice, but felt limited by our need for his steady salary and health insurance benefits. David's entrepreneurial ambitions would be completely achievable if he knew about our actual financial circumstances, but he was making career decisions based on imaginary economic constraints that prevented him from pursuing work that would align with his values and utilize his talents more effectively. Watching him sacrifice his professional dreams to maintain financial security that we didn't actually need was becoming one of the most painful aspects of continuing my deception. The irony was particularly acute because David's software development expertise would be tremendously valuable for Santos Organic Markets' technology modernization efforts, while the business connections and industry knowledge I had developed through my grandmother's legacy could support his consulting ambitions in ways that would benefit both our personal and professional goals. We could be genuine partners supporting each other's success instead of strangers sharing living expenses while pursuing separate dreams under artificial constraints. The acquisition offer forced me to confront the reality that my deception was not just affecting our relationship, but actually preventing both of us from achieving our potential individually and as partners. David deserved the opportunity to make informed decisions about his career based on accurate information about our circumstances, while I owed it to my grandmother's legacy to consider opportunities that could expand the impact of the business she had built. Victoria's increasing suspicions about my background added another layer of pressure to the already complex situation. She had begun making comments about inconsistencies between my supposed financial situation and my apparent comfort with expensive lifestyle choices that David's salary alone couldn't support. Her observations were becoming more detailed and more pointed, suggesting that she was actively gathering evidence to support her theory that I was deceiving David about fundamental aspects of our relationship. During a casual conversation at TechFlow's office holiday party, Victoria had mentioned noticing that I always seemed well informed about business developments and market trends that she wouldn't expect someone working in nonprofit community development to follow closely. She had also observed that I demonstrated familiarity with retail operations and supply chain management that seemed unusually sophisticated for someone whose professional experience was supposedly limited to volunteer work. Victoria's detective work was methodical and professional, reflecting the analytical skills that made her successful in her corporate role. She was building a case against my credibility that would eventually become impossible to ignore or deflect, and her motivation for exposing what she perceived as my deception was becoming increasingly personal as she positioned herself as a more suitable partner for David's professional trajectory. The situation reached a crisis point when Victoria directly asked David whether he had ever wondered how I could afford certain lifestyle choices on the income I claimed to earn from part-time nonprofit work. She suggested that successful men needed to be cautious about partners who might not be completely honest about their financial circumstances, particularly when those partners demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that exceeded their supposed professional experience. David's response to Victoria's questions revealed his growing uncertainty about aspects of our relationship that he had previously accepted without investigation. While he defended my character and our partnership, I could see that her observations had planted seeds of doubt about my honesty and transparency in areas that were fundamental to our marriage. His trust in me remained strong, but it was no longer absolute, and Victoria's continued scrutiny would eventually force confrontations that I wasn't prepared to handle. The convergence of the acquisition opportunity, David's career frustrations, and Victoria's investigation created pressure that made maintaining my deception impossible. I could delay the California company's offer, continue limiting David's professional options, and try to deflect Victoria's suspicions, but these temporary solutions would only postpone more serious problems while creating additional complications that would be harder to resolve. Robert called again 3 days later to inform me that the California company was requesting preliminary financial statements and operational reports that would allow them to prepare a formal offer. They wanted to schedule site visits to our key locations and interviews with our management team before the end of December, which meant that I had less than 3 weeks to decide whether to participate in the acquisition process or decline their interest entirely. The timing was particularly challenging because it coincided with TechFlow Solutions' year-end review process, during which David would be evaluated for potential promotion to a senior technical leadership position that could significantly advance his career. His performance review would include assessment of his leadership potential and strategic thinking capabilities, areas where his actual talents were underutilized because of his concerns about our household's financial stability and his reluctance to take professional risks that might affect our economic security. David's potential promotion would also require increased social integration with TechFlow's senior management and their families. creating additional opportunities for Victoria and others to scrutinize our relationship and investigate inconsistencies between my supposed circumstances and my actual knowledge and capabilities. The professional advancement that David deserved would make maintaining my deception more difficult, while simultaneously making the consequences of discovery more damaging to his career prospects. I realized that I was approaching a decision point that would determine not just the future of our relationship, but also the trajectory of both our professional lives and the legacy of my grandmother's work. I could continue trying to manage multiple deceptions while limiting both David's opportunities and the potential impact of Santos Organic Markets, or I could choose honesty that would create immediate complications but allow us to move forward as genuine partners. The California acquisition offer represented more than just a business opportunity, it was a catalyst that would force resolution of contradictions I had been managing through careful performance and strategic avoidance. Whether I pursued the acquisition or declined it, the process had already created pressure that would make my continued deception unsustainable. The question was no longer whether to reveal my true circumstances, but how to do so in a way that preserved the relationships and opportunities that mattered most while taking responsibility for the mistakes I had made in concealing information that affected everyone involved. The catalyst had been introduced, and the chemical reaction that would transform everything was already beginning. As December approached with its intensified social obligations and business deadlines, I knew that the comfortable routine I had maintained for 4 years was ending. The acquisition discussions would proceed with or without my participation, David's career review would advance based on assumptions about our financial constraints, and Victoria's investigation would continue until she found evidence that supported her suspicions about my authenticity. The only variable I could control was whether to reveal the truth proactively on my own terms or allow circumstances to expose it in ways that would damage the trust and relationships I had been trying to protect through years of careful deception. The catalyst had been introduced, and now I had to decide whether to guide the reaction or let it proceed without my intervention. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.